the 12th of May 1945. The war in Europe had ended only days before, yet for thousands of captured women in grey uniforms the nightmare felt far from over. At a railway siding near Le Havre, France, boxcars rattled in the damp morning air, waiting to take their human cargo westward. Among them was Hilde Bauer, 23 years old, once a communications assistant in the Luftwaffe. She had grown up on stories that Americans were brutal, merciless, that captivity meant dishonor worse than death. Propaganda had painted lurid pictures, starvation, humiliation, even worse for women. Every mile west her dread grew heavier. The port smelled of coal, dust, salt spray and engine grease. Steam hissed, boots scraped on metal gangways. Hilde clutched her thin coat, already bracing for insults or blows. Instead, a quiet shock broke her defenses. A Red Cross volunteer pressed a small paper bag into her hands. Inside lay a bar of soap wrapped in wax paper, a folded towel, and unbelievably a tiny glass vial of lilac perfume. Hilde froze. Perfume. For a prisoner. She lifted the stopper, and the scent of springtime gardens rushed out, carrying her back to a memory of her mother watering flowers before the war. Her chest tightened, torn between suspicion and longing. She had been told to expect cruelty. Instead, she held a fragrance of gentleness. If the enemy could hand her perfume in place of punishment, what else, she wondered with unease, had been a lie all along? The crossing of the Atlantic in the summer of 1945 was a journey through uncertainty. On the deck of the transport ship, Hilde Bauer wrapped herself in her thin military coat and pressed against the railing, the ocean wind whipping her face. She had been herded aboard with dozens of other female auxiliaries, most of them Luftwaffe or Wehrmacht clerks, drivers or nurses. Some wept quietly. Others clung stubbornly to the steel discipline drilled into them, chin-high, back-straight words, clipped and cold. None of them spoke aloud what they truly feared, the whispers of what Americans did to women in captivity. German propaganda had promised that capture meant degradation. The women were told to expect insults, shouted in broken German, to be paraded as trophies stripped of dignity. The men, they believed, might be starved or beaten, but the women, so the story went, would suffer worse. Every rumour grew in the retelling, and by the time Hilde's group was marched aboard, their imaginations had painted America as a land of cruel victors, waiting to exact revenge. Yet the voyage itself was unsettlingly calm. The U.S. Navy crew spoke little to them, but moved with quiet efficiency. Meals were passed down in trays of boiled potatoes, vegetables, bread, and sometimes even meat. The women glanced at one another in disbelief. "This is just the crossing," one muttered. "They are fattening us up before the real punishment." Hilde wanted to believe that explanation. Anything else was too strange. Halfway across, Red Cross workers distributed parcels, toothbrushes, tooth powder, a comb, and a fresh bar of soap stamped with English letters. Hilde turned the object over in her palm. It was heavy, almost creamy, nothing like the grey slivers she had used back home, that crumbled to dust after a single wash. She inhaled it cautiously. The smell was sharp and clean, like crushed pine needles. "Soap for prisoners," she whispered to herself, unsettled. The ship finally docked in Boston. Hilde caught her first glimpse of America, through the salt-streaked porthole cranes, warehouses, long lines of soldiers in pressed uniforms. The docks smelled of tar and roasted coffee drifting from nearby warehouses. The women were hurried off their boots, clanging on the gangplank, then onto waiting trains that would take them inland. Guards with rifles walked beside them, but they did not shout, did not shove. Their silence was almost worse. The journey westward was long, cutting through rolling fields and small towns where children waved from crossings. Hilde stared, unable to reconcile these cheerful faces with the monsters she had been told to expect. The train rattled on until after days of travel they arrived at a camp near Algona, Iowa, a place surrounded not by watchtowers bristling with machine guns, but by neat fences and orderly barracks painted a pale, almost welcoming shade. Still, fear tightened her chest. This must be a trick. The barracks would surely be filthy. Disease and hunger would break them. That was what she braced for as the gates swung open. The first shock came at processing. They were lined up in a long hall, then separated into small groups. Instead of barking orders, the American officers spoke slowly, almost gently through translators. Each woman was given a number and asked for her name, rank, and place of birth. Their belongings were tagged and locked away. Then came the unimaginable delousing powder, hot showers, and after months of living in dust and fear, fresh towels. Hilde hesitated as the warm water poured over her shoulders. She half expected someone to fling open the door and laugh cruelly. But nothing happened. The only sound was the hiss of the water and the muffled sobs of relief from the women beside her. After the showers, they were issued clean clothes. Not fine dresses, but sturdy cotton skirts, blouses and underwear, all new, still carrying the faint scent of starch. Each was given a jacket with large white letters PW painted on the back. Hilde fingered the cloth, stunned. At home, her sister wore patched garments, sewn from old curtains. Here, prisoners were handed clothing cleaner than anything she had seen in years. The barracks held another surprise. Each bunk had a proper mattress, 2 crisp sheets, and a wool blanket folded with military precision. Hilde sat gingerly on the edge, feeling the spring of the mattress beneath her. It smelled faintly of soap, as if it had been scrubbed recently. For a moment she simply stared, unable to believe she was meant to sleep here. Then came the mess hall. The women shuffled inside, eyes darting, prepared for insults. Instead, the space was brightly lit with electric bulbs. Stainless steel trays gleamed in neat stacks. The air was heavy, with a smell so foreign it almost knocked Hilde backward. Sizzling bacon, fresh coffee, and warm bread. Her stomach clenched. For months she had lived on thin soups and coarse bread. Now the aroma of fat and salt filled her nostrils. She felt dizzy, unmoored. An American cook in a white apron ladled food without a word, his expression calm, almost indifferent. Hilde's hands trembled as she accepted the tray. On it sat eggs, bacon, a slice of bread, spread with butter, and a mug of steaming coffee. The sight was surreal. She whispered to the woman beside her, "This can't be real. They will take it away." But no one came to snatch it back. As she sat at the long wooden table, her eyes caught something else. A local volunteer, an American woman in a plain dress, likely from one of the nearby churches, moved quietly down the row of new arrivals. From a basket she drew small bottles and placed one before each woman. When she reached Hilde, she set down a tiny vial of perfume. "For the ladies," she said softly, with a smile that was neither mocking nor triumphant. "Welcome, and may you rest." Hilde could not move. Her throat closed. A prisoner of war handed perfume as if she were a guest. The cork stopper seemed to burn in her fingers. She could not bring herself to open it, not in front of the others. She slid it quickly into her pocket, her heart hammering. That night, lying on her bunk beneath the clean wool blanket, Hilde took out the vial. The glass caught the dim light of the overhead lamp. She opened it just a fraction, and the scent of lilac drifted up. Her eyes stung with tears. She thought of her mother's garden before the bombings of evenings when the air was heavy with blossoms and laughter. Now that same fragrance came from the hands of her captors. The contradiction was unbearable. She had been trained to expect cruelty, yet here she was with soap-clean clothes, a full belly and perfume at her bedside. She wanted to believe it was a trick. She wanted the cruelty to come so she could hate them without doubt. But as she inhaled the sweetness, she felt her certainty crumbling. The night passed slowly. Outside, the guards walked their quiet patrols. Inside, Hilde lay awake, the perfume pressed to her chest. For the first time, she wondered whether the walls of propaganda that had shaped her life were beginning to crack, not from force, but from mercy. Morning in the camp began not with shouts or blows, but with the metallic clang of a bell echoing across the barracks. Hilde stirred in her bunk, blinking at the ceiling beams above. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The mattress beneath her was soft, the blanket still smelled faintly of soap, and the clean cotton of her issued skirt brushed her skin. Then the bell rang again, and reality returned. She was a prisoner of war in America, yet nothing about this captivity fit the nightmares she had been told to expect. The roll call formed the backbone of each day. Rows of women lined up outside their barracks, breath clouding in the cool Iowa morning. Guards with rifles paced nearby, but their faces remained impassive, their voices even. Through a translator, the American sergeant called names, ticked boxes, and moved on. No jeers, no insults. just routine. Hilde found the calmness unnerving. She longed almost for cruelty, because cruelty would have confirmed the world she knew. Instead, she was met with silence, efficiency, and order. After roll call came inspections. Barracks were checked for tidiness, beds made with sheets tucked, tight blankets, folded floors swept. The women obeyed with stiff precision. It felt strangely familiar. After all, they had been drilled in discipline during their service in the Reich. Yet here that same discipline was demanded not by their officers but by their captors. Each morning Hilde polished the small metal locker she had been assigned. Inside lay her folded clothes, her issued towel, and the precious vial of lilac perfume she had hidden carefully beneath a stack of underwear. She feared losing it as much as she feared losing her sanity. Soap became a new currency. Each week prisoners received rations of toiletries, a bar of soap, tooth powder, sometimes a small tin of ointment. To Hilde, the first bar she held in her hand felt like a miracle, white, smooth, able to lather thick foam that washed away the grime of months of war. She remembered her sister in Hanover using scraps of brown substitute soap that barely cleaned at all. Hilde would stand under the camp, showers water rushing over her body, and feel a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief at being clean, guilt that her family back home had no such luxury. The mess hall became both a comfort and a torment. Each meal followed the same routine: trays, lined-up cooks, ladling portions with mechanical precision. Breakfast might be oatmeal with sugar, sometimes eggs, and always coffee that steamed like a balm in the morning chill. Lunch could be stews with chunks of beef or chicken, vegetables, bread with butter. Dinner brought soups, potatoes, and once a week meatloaf or roast. Hilde ate slowly, her mind torn between gratitude and suspicion. Was this food truly hers to enjoy, or was it meant to soften her, to weaken her resistance? She scribbled in a notebook she had begun to keep mercy as weapon. The phrase haunted her. Daily life also included work. The women were assigned to light duties, sewing uniforms, repairing nets, sorting seeds for local farms. Sometimes they were escorted outside the wire to help on nearby fields, always with guards watching closely. Hilde found herself bending over rows of corn, the soil rich and black beneath her hands. American farmers would glance at the prisoners with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Once an elderly woman offered a jug of cold water, her eyes gentle. Hilde could hardly bring herself to drink, so deep was her suspicion. Yet thirst overcame pride, and she sipped. The water was cool, clear, almost sweet. It left her shaken. The camp also offered unexpected glimpses of normalcy. A library shack stood near the mess hall, stocked with books donated by churches and schools. At first Hilde avoided it, fearing propaganda, but curiosity won. She leafed through illustrated magazines filled with images of smiling families, abundant harvests, advertisements for soap, coffee, even cars. She could not reconcile this abundance with the bombed-out ruins of her hometown. In evenings, the camp newspaper circulated, written partly by the prisoners themselves. It included crossword puzzles, essays, and translated news from abroad. Reading it felt like peering into another universe. Fridays brought films. A projector whirred in the recreation hall, casting flickering images on a white sheet. Newsreels showed American soldiers liberating towns, children waving flags, factories humming with production. Then came full-length features, comedies, westerns, romances. Hilde sat rigid in the back row, watching Clark Gable tip his hat with a smile. The laughter of her fellow prisoners rang out, uneasy at first, then freer. Hilde did not laugh. She could not. Instead, she watched, heart aching, as if the moving images pulled her further away from everything she thought she knew. The greatest contrast, however, came from the letters. Prisoners were allowed to write home. Hilde received her first reply weeks later, a crumpled page from her cousin in Hanover written in shaky ink. It described children crying from hunger streets filled with rubble families living on watery soup. As she read, her stomach churned with the memory of her last meal: thick, stew potatoes, bread with butter. The contrast was unbearable. Inside the fence there was food, order, and soap. Outside, in the land she still called Heimat, there was only ruin. She pressed the letter to her chest, tears staining the paper. At night, when the barracks grew quiet, Hilde would take out the perfume. Just one drop on her wrist, just one breath. The scent was fragile, like springtime breaking through winter. But it also carried weight. The more she treasured it, the more she felt she was betraying her homeland. Her mother had taught her that perfume was for celebrations, for Sundays when church bells rang. Now, in captivity, she inhaled it with a mixture of shame and comfort. She hid it quickly when footsteps approached, fearful the others might see and accuse her of weakness. The psychological battle never ceased. By day she obeyed, ate, worked, washed. By night she wrestled with questions that tore at her soul. Could kindness be genuine in the hands of an enemy? If so, what did that say about the Reich promises, about all the speeches she had heard, the banners she had marched under? Her diary grew thick with contradictions. On one page, they want to trick us. On another, why would they give us perfume if they wished only to break us? Some women coped by denying reality, convincing themselves that this treatment was temporary, that punishment lurked around the corner. Others gave in, laughing at the films, humming American songs under their breath. Hilde wavered between these poles, never able to rest fully in either. Her life had become a strange theatre, where the enemy wore the mask of kindness, and she feared the mask would slip at any moment. One evening, as she lay in her bunk, she overheard two women whispering. "I almost feel safe here," one confessed. "Don't say that," the other hissed. "If they hear, they'll think we are grateful." The words chilled Hilde. Gratitude had become its own form of betrayal, yet gratitude seeped in nonetheless. Each time she scrubbed her hands and watched foam gather, each time she pulled on clean clothes, each time she smelled the faint trace of lilac from her secret vial, she felt a piece of herself soften. She hated that softness. She feared it more than hunger, and still she could not deny it. Camp life stretched on, measured not in battles or headlines, but in small, ordinary routines: the clang of the bell, the smell of soap, the scrape of trays in the mess hall, the hum of projectors on Friday nights. Each routine chipped away at the fortress of fear and propaganda she had carried with her. Each day left her with the same haunting question: was she living in a prison or in an unexpected refuge carved from the contradictions of war? Autumn descended on the Iowa plains with a crispness that cut through the mornings. Frost dusted the fields beyond the barbed wire, and the guards wore heavier coats. For Hilde, the camp routine had grown familiar, yet the contradictions gnawed deeper every day. She ate, bathed, folded her clean clothes, and read letters that described starvation back home. Each act of comfort was a reminder of her own betrayal, or so she believed. Then came Thanksgiving, 1945. To the Americans it was a holiday. To the German prisoners it was just another Thursday on the calendar. Yet from early morning the air around the camp hinted at something unusual. Extra deliveries arrived at the kitchen. Soldiers carried sacks of flour and boxes of apples. The scent of cinnamon and roasting meat drifted on the cold air, curling into the barracks like an invitation. The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. "It's another test," one whispered. "They will tempt us, then mock us." By late afternoon the mess hall was transformed. Long tables were covered with paper cloths, trays stacked neatly, coffee urns gleaming. Local volunteers, mostly church women with aprons tied around their waists, moved about briskly. Their faces showed no malice, only the brisk concentration of people preparing a feast. The women POWs were marched in the crunch of their boots, muffled on the wooden floor. Hilde's heart pounded. She clutched the edge of her jacket, still bearing the bold white letters PW. She stopped short when she saw what lay upon the tables. Apple pies, golden crusts glistening, lined the center like jewels. Platters of roast turkey, bowls of mashed potatoes, whipped with butter plates stacked with thick slices of bread. And the smell: sweet apples laced with cinnamon, savory bacon sizzling in pans, the unmistakable richness of peanut butter spread on soft white bread. The aroma was almost unbearable. For Hilde it was not merely food. It was a memory, an ambush of the senses. She was transported back to her childhood kitchen, to Sundays when her mother baked Apfelkuchen, the scent filling their modest home in Hanover. She saw her father at the table, newspapers folded, her sister giggling as the crust crumbled under her fork. Those moments felt like another lifetime. Yet here in captivity the memory returned with brutal clarity. The scent of apples and cinnamon wrapped around her heart like a vice. But memory came tangled with dread. To eat, she feared, was to surrender. Was this not the very weapon she had scrawled about in her notebook? mercy as weapon. Every bite risked reshaping her loyalties, eroding the last defenses of her indoctrination. What did it mean to savor the enemy's food while her own people starved? The women sat trays before them. An American chaplain spoke briefly, his words translated, "Thanks for peace, hope for the future." Hilde kept her eyes down, but she could feel the warmth of the food radiating from the table. Steam rose from mashed potatoes swimming in gravy. The pies glistened. Her stomach growled loudly enough to make her blush. Then came the moment of decision. A volunteer placed a slice of apple pie on her tray. Hilde's fingers hovered. The crust was flaky, delicate. The filling bubbled, spiced with cinnamon. She brought it closer, her hand trembling. She hesitated, glancing at the women beside her. Some stared resolutely forward, refusing to touch the food. Others surrendered at once, shoveling bites into their mouths with tears streaming down their faces. Inside Hilde's pocket lay the tiny vial of lilac perfume. She pressed it as if the glass could anchor her. The scent of flowers and the scent of apples blended in her mind, two fragments of a life that seemed impossible now. She closed her eyes. To reject the food was to cling to an ideology already crumbling. To accept it was to risk betraying everything she had believed. Her lips parted. The fork rose. The first bite of apple pie touched her tongue. Sweetness and spice flooded her senses, overwhelming her resolve. Tears spilled unbidden hot against her cheeks. She chewed slowly each bite, an act of surrender, an act of revelation. The pie was not poisoned, not a trick. It was simply food offered with mercy. The floodgates opened. She remembered laughter at her family table, the warm kitchen light, her mother's soft humming. Yet she also remembered the propaganda posters, the warnings of cruelty, the oaths she had sworn. Now both worlds collided on her tongue. She swallowed, and the room swam with contradictions. Around her other women wept openly. Some clutched their forks as if afraid to let go. Others covered their faces in shame. Afterward, Hilde sat with her tray empty, staring at the crumbs of crust. She lifted her wrist to her nose, catching the faint trace of soap from the morning wash, mingling with the perfume still lingering from the vial. Soap, clean clothes, perfume, and now pie, each a thread of kindness binding her more tightly to her captors than chains ever could. That night, back in her bunk, she wrote in her diary, "Today I ate their food. It tasted of my childhood, of things I thought destroyed. If this is a weapon, it is stronger than any gun. I am undone." The realization chilled her. Mercy, she understood now, had its own terrible power. A slap she could have endured, hunger she could have defied. But kindness seeped into her soul, corroding the iron walls built by years of indoctrination. She pressed the perfume vial to her lips, tears wetting the glass. She had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Winter deepened across Iowa snow, frosting the barbed wire and weighing down the roofs of the barracks. Inside, life for the prisoners settled into a rhythm that seemed almost ordinary, though nothing about it felt ordinary to Hilde. She woke each morning under clean sheets, ate meals richer than her family back in Germany could dream of, and washed with soap that foamed thick and white. Each small comfort pressed on her conscience like a stone. She told herself she was still loyal, still German, still a soldier's daughter. Yet the cracks in her certainty spread wider with every passing week. It began with the English classes. The camp offered voluntary lessons in the evenings taught by a young American woman who had once been a schoolteacher. Hilde resisted at first, refusing to attend, but curiosity gnawed at her. One night she slipped into the back of the classroom, notebook in hand. The teacher wrote a single word on the chalkboard: freedom. She said it slowly, inviting the women to repeat. The sound rolled strangely off Hilde's tongue. Freedom. The teacher explained in patient German what the word meant to her country: the right to speak, to read, to choose leaders. Hilde frowned. These were things she had been told were dangerous, even decadent. She copied the word carefully, tracing the letters like a secret. The library shack became her second battlefield. She leafed through magazines filled with images of American families smiling around dinner tables, children clutching toys, women advertising, soap, perfume, and dresses. Every page radiated abundance, a world untouched by the starvation devouring her homeland. She found herself drawn to a battered copy of Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men. The simple language pulled her in the story of two drifters chasing a dream of land and home. She read by the dim light of the barracks, turning each page with trembling hands. The novel's sadness pierced her, but it was the humanity of the characters that unsettled her most. They were not demons. They were just people. Then came the newsreels. On Fridays, the projector flickered to life, showing the prisoners a version of the world they had never seen. Hilde sat rigid as images of concentration camps appeared on the screen. Skeletal figures stumbling through barbed wire gates, piles of shoes, children staring with hollow eyes. The Americans called them liberated prisoners. Hilde's stomach clenched. Propaganda back home had claimed such stories were Allied lies. Yet here it was in grainy black and white, undeniable. Women around her gasped, some covering their mouths. One whispered, "It cannot be true." Hilde wanted to agree, but the images burrowed into her mind, lodging like shards of glass. The camp newspaper arrived next, passed from hand to hand. Written partly by prisoners, it included articles translated from American press. One edition carried reports of the Nuremberg trials of Nazi leaders being held to account for atrocities. Hilde read every word, her pulse racing. If the leaders had lied about these crimes, what else had they lied about? She folded the paper and slipped it under her pillow, unable to throw it away, unable to face it again. Letters from home continued to arrive, smudged with dirt and grief. Her cousin wrote of a bitter winter of bread made from sawdust of children with swollen bellies. The words burned Hilde's throat. She had eaten meatloaf and apple pie the same week her family starved. She imagined her sister wrapped in rags while she herself slept under a wool blanket. Shame washed over her in waves so strong she sometimes felt she could not breathe. One night she could no longer contain the storm. She pulled out her diary and scrawled furiously, "If this kindness is a lie, it is the most dangerous lie I have ever known. But if it is true, then what else have I been blind to?" Her pen cut deep grooves into the paper. She stared at the words, horrified by her own betrayal. The other women wrestled with the same torment. Some clung to their hatred, dismissing every kindness as manipulation. Others surrendered to comfort, laughing too loudly at American films, humming jazz tunes under their breath. Hilde hovered between torn in two. By day she folded laundry and scrubbed floors with practiced obedience. By night she lay awake, the perfume vial pressed to her chest, listening to the echo of the word she had learned, freedom. The chaplain visited often, bringing books and gentle words. He offered her a Bible, its leather worn smooth. Hilde accepted it reluctantly, but curiosity drove her to read. She lingered on passages about forgiveness, about truth setting one free. They stirred something she had not felt in years, the idea that loyalty and cruelty were not the same. Her transformation crystallized during a quiet evening when she was asked to tutor an older prisoner who could barely read. She hesitated. Why should she help? Yet when she saw his trembling hands, she agreed. She traced letters with him, teaching him to write his name. He looked at her with gratitude, so raw it pierced her. In that moment, she felt something shift. She was no longer just a captive, but a participant in humanity's fragile web of kindness. Later, she wrote a letter in secret. Not to her family, not to the authorities, but to the lady with lilac perfume. She poured out her confusion, gratitude, shame, and the unbearable weight of kindness. She never knew if the letter reached anyone, but writing it was an act of surrender. By spring 1946, Hilde's ideological walls had collapsed. She no longer believed in the slogans of the Reich. The apple pie, the soap, the clean clothes, the words she had learned in English class, all had eroded her certainty more thoroughly than hunger or fear ever could. Yet this collapse did not bring peace. Instead, it left her adrift in guilt and longing. She was free from lies, yet bound by the memory of how easily they had once defined her. She looked at her fellow prisoners and saw the same conflict etched on their faces. They were captives, yes, but they were also witnesses to a truth their homeland had hidden. The paradox weighed on them like an invisible chain. To admit the truth meant betraying their past. To deny it meant betraying themselves. Hilde often thought of that first night when she held the perfume vial and wondered if kindness could be a trap. Now she knew the answer. Mercy was not a trap. It was a mirror. And what she saw in that mirror terrified her, not the face of an enemy but her own reflection, questioning everything she had ever believed. The train that carried Hilde Bauer home in the summer of 1946 rattled across a landscape that felt foreign to her, though it was the very soil of her own country. She pressed her forehead against the grimy window, clutching the bundle of belongings she had been given upon, release a wool coat, a few undergarments, a loaf of bread, and hidden deep in her bag, the small vial of lilac perfume. Every turn of the wheels seemed to echo with the question that had haunted her for months: who was she now, after all she had seen? When the train screeched into Bremerhaven, the smell of ash and sea salt mingled in the air. The platform swarmed with gaunt figures, civilians scavenging for food, children darting between the legs of returning prisoners, Red Cross workers with clipboards. Hilde stepped onto German soil with trembling knees. The wooden planks under her boots felt both familiar and alien. She had dreamed of this moment for a year, yet now her chest tightened with dread. The journey inland was a descent into devastation. Town after town lay in ruins, skeletal frames of buildings standing against the sky like gravestones. Roads were cratered, bridges collapsed. Fields once fertile now lay fallow, dotted with makeshift huts built from salvaged wood. The contrast to Iowa's ordered farmland was stark and painful. Hilde bit her lip until it bled, unwilling to weep in front of the strangers around her. At last she reached Hanover, or what remained of it. The station was a husk, its roof gone, its tracks twisted. Streets she had once walked as a child were reduced to rubble. She stumbled through alleys where hungry dogs nosed at scraps. When she reached what had been her family's house, only a blackened wall stood. A neighbor, eyes hollow, recognized her. "Your mother died last winter," the woman said flatly. "Pneumonia. There was no medicine." Hilde's knees buckled. Her sister appeared thin as a shadow, cheeks, sunken hair brittle. They embraced, wordlessly, tears soaking into each other's rags. The reunion, however, carried no joy. Whispers followed Hilde wherever she went. "She ate well in America," someone muttered. "She looks strong. She must have betrayed us." The irony was bitter. She felt guilty for every extra pound she had gained in captivity, guilty for every meal that had filled her belly while her neighbors starved. Now that guilt was thrown back at her like an accusation. Local officials summoned her, demanding she account for her time in America. Did she collaborate? Did she bring back propaganda? Hilde's answers, no, no, and no, were met with skeptical frowns. The very things that had shaken her faith, the soap, the food, the perfume, were treated as proof that she had been seduced by the enemy. She left the interrogation trembling, clutching her coat around her like armor. At home, or what passed for home life, was harsher than any camp. Food was scarce. Bread was rationed in thin slices, potatoes eked out in watery stews. Children cried themselves to sleep, their ribs sharp under their skin. Each time Hilde smelled the faint trace of lilac from her hidden vial, her stomach twisted with shame. She longed for the abundance of the camp, yet despised herself for longing. The perfume became her secret. She had hidden it in the loose floorboard beneath her bed. Late at night, when her sister slept, Hilde would retrieve it. She would unstopper the vial, letting the fragrance bloom for a moment in the air, sweet, fragile, incongruous against the backdrop of soot and hunger. Sometimes she dabbed a drop on her wrist, then washed her sister's face with the last sliver of American soap she had smuggled home. It was a ritual of survival, a reminder that dignity had not died completely, but it was also a ritual of guilt. Each breath of lilac whispered of kindness from enemies of a world that had fed her while her family starved. She wrote in her diary with a trembling hand, "I live with two ghosts, the ghost of my mother and the ghost of Mercy. Both haunt me. Both demand I remember." The diary filled with fragments, memories of bacon sizzling in the mess hall, of apple pie steaming on Thanksgiving tables, of English words chalked on camp boards. Each entry was an attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable, that captivity had offered more nourishment, more humanity, than freedom now did. Neighbors looked at her with suspicion. When she wore the clean skirt she had brought from America, whispers hissed, "Look at her, still dressed in the enemy's cloth." She quickly hid it away, wrapping herself in rags like everyone else. Yet at night she sometimes pulled it out, ran her fingers along the seams, and remembered the strange paradox of being treated with dignity by those she had been told were monsters. Years later the memory would not fade. Even as Germany rebuilt, as new houses rose from rubble and markets filled again with bread and milk, Hilde kept the vial. Its contents dwindled drop by drop until only the faintest trace remained. She never told anyone the full truth. To confess that she had been cared for, clothed and perfumed by Americans was to invite scorn, even hatred. And so she carried the memory alone, a private paradox pressed between the pages of her diary. Yet in her solitude she understood something that others did not. She had seen with her own eyes the power of mercy. She had lived in a camp where kindness dismantled ideology more effectively than violence ever could. And though she carried shame, she also carried a fragile gratitude. In the darkness of post-war Germany, she whispered to herself, "I survived because of soap, because of clean clothes, because of lilac." The war had ended, but the battle within her never truly ceased. Hilde lived the rest of her life, caught between two worlds, the rubble of her homeland and the strange, haunting memory of a camp where mercy reigned. History is often remembered in the clash of armies, in the roar of artillery, and in the ruins left behind. Yet sometimes its most enduring lessons are carried in smaller, quieter things. The scent of lilac drifting from a tiny vial, the lather of soap against tired skin, the taste of warm apple pie in a mess hall filled with prisoners. For Hilde Bauer and countless other women who endured captivity, these details became symbols far larger than their size. She had entered the camp expecting whips, hunger, and humiliation. Instead, she was handed clean clothes, a wool blanket, and even perfume. The shock of kindness unsettled her more deeply than cruelty ever could. For cruelty she had been trained to resist, but mercy forced her to question. If the enemy could give her dignity, then what else had been a lie in all those years of slogans and marching songs? This was the quiet paradox of war, that soft power, food soap, and small tokens of humanity could pierce walls that bombs could not. A spoonful of peanut butter, a clean skirt, or a gentle smile carried an authority that propaganda could not erase. Hilde's perfume vial, secreted away through her release and returned to a broken Germany, was not simply a keepsake. It was proof that even in the darkest chapters compassion had survived. The irony remained sharp. She had braced for brutality only to be disarmed by kindness, and the memory never left her. In every ruined street of post-war Hanover, in every hushed whisper of suspicion cast at her, she remembered the moment an American woman set perfume in her hand. Mercy had marked her forever. And so the question lingers long after the guns fell silent. If compassion could exist even in the midst of total war, what else? What greater possibilities might have always been within humanity's reach?